We're going to go straight to our final speaker in this panel, Ambassador Luis Alfonso de Alba, who is a career diplomat since 1983, and currently Mexico's ambassador to Austria, Slovenia, and Slovakia, and permanent representative to the international organizations in Vienna. Among other things, he's previously served as the permanent representative of Mexico to the United States, to the United Nations in New York, permanent representative to the UN and other international organizations in Geneva, and special rep for climate change. It's especially during that period that we're interested in what he achieved and what he learned traveling around the world. He told us in an interview he spent during that year before the COP 16 in Cancun, 200 and some days on the road. Do you remember what it did?
40 to 80, 240 to 200, depending on whether you count
80 days on the road, traveling overseas, meeting with negotiators from around the world. He also mentioned in that interview how much he had learned in his time as the first president of the Human Rights Council of the UN in Geneva. So anyway, that was very interesting point, that some of the same negotiating techniques and listening style ended up being very important for the success of Cancun and your work in that. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
You can speak here or up there. It's up to you.
Well, let me stay here. Let me start by thanking you and the Brown University for the opportunity to be here. I'm going to try not to repeat some of the points that have already been made and which I totally share from President Lagos, President Calderon, Cristiana, and especially Minister Pulgar lately. But I would start with some reflections on the future rather than the past, and I argue why I think it is important to move in a certain direction based on our experience in preparing Cancun. The first point I would like to make is that saying that Lima is more important than Paris is not a slogan, it's not a political statement. It is a reality. If we do not succeed in Lima, we will not succeed in Paris by far. The time to prepare Paris is going to be much shorter than everybody expected, because if we want to have a legally binding instrument in Paris, it needs to be ready by this time next year. So we don't have a full year for preparation to Paris. That means that the draft that we may consider in Lima may still be polished for a few months, but very few months before it is stable and finalized during the year. So it is quite important. It is also important to imagine or to recognize that it is possible to achieve that kind of agreement in Lima and not in Paris because of Peru and because of France, because of the position of both countries and the role they play. Latin America, Peru, as well as Mexico did in the past, play a kind of a bridging role, not in the sense of a Solomonic decision to be in the middle of the equation, but basically because we share concerns with both sides. We face challenges which are similar to developed economies, because our economies are strong and growing, but at the same time we also have poverty, we also have vulnerabilities, etc. So that bridging role that we have is quite important to achieve an agreement between the G77 as a whole on the one hand, the Americans, the members of the umbrella group in general. You need that kind of attitude. I think it is also possible because to achieve something in Lima rather than in Paris, because of the diplomatic tradition, because in the UN, and what I'm going to say is not new, I think I told you in the interview, but it is quite a sin to say it in public. The UN process is a very, very contaminated process on which arguments in the name of transparency, inclusiveness, state-led processes, etc., are mainly used by spoilers. And because of that, we do not move. And because of the call for this transparency, inclusivity, etc., and the interpretation of consensus, like President Lagos was pointing out at the beginning, an interpretation that Mexico did not share. But because of that interpretation, they feel they have a veto and they can slow the process and derail the negotiations. And Minister Pulgar, in particular, has an opportunity, and he already referred to it, to exercise a strong presidency. That was done in the case of Mexico. The leadership in that sense is a fundamental one, but I would make a parenthesis to highlight, not only because President Calderon is present in this room, but because I believe it very honestly, that leadership starts at the level of leaders. That if you do not have a number of heads of state and government very much involved and behind, the leadership in the presidency of the COP could not be as effective. You need to work on both levels. You need a pressure at the international level, and then you need to exercise your own autonomy, your own authority during the process. Coming back to the process itself, I believe that, and we heard Cristiana Figueres reminded us that the drafting is a collective process, etc. I believe that's true. I have been working at the UN for more than 30 years, and it has always been that way. But this is only half of the truth. The other half is that most of the agreements need to be pre-cooked in smaller gatherings. It needs to be pre-cooked in informal meetings. It needs to be pre-cooked by traveling, by meeting people and identifying possible solutions, possible compromises. And in that sense, informal meetings and smaller meetings are quite important. In the case of Mexico, we organize that kind of informal meetings at all levels. Meetings that President Calderon himself conducted through video conferences and using opportunities to meet with leaders in different settings. Meetings at the level of ministers, both the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Environment, and meetings which I presided myself in Mexico, inviting delegations to go to Mexico to address in a parallel manner, but in a very coordinated manner at the same time, discussions on substance, whether it was mitigation, financing, etc. So in that sense, I think what we need to do, especially from now to Lima, is to intensify that process of informal consultation and identification of not only what the issues are, but the possible solutions to those issues. And I'm jumping from one topic to another one, but I think it will be important to going in this direction to identify some of the big questions which are in the minds of many of us, and Minister Pulgar referred to them as well as President Lagos in a certain sense. I think if we assume that we are going to replace Kyoto in Lima, we are wrong, that we will not achieve that. That we will not get not only consensus, but we will not even have a majority on our side. I think we need to be a little more pragmatic. We need to keep Kyoto as it is, but we need to identify ways and means to strengthen the system. And you have not only the problem of building something in addition to Kyoto, but something that will differentiate between the responsibilities of the U.S. on one hand, and now Japan and others who have left Kyoto, and China, India, Mexico, and others. So you need three instruments, not one. Kyoto is going to be one. The second needs to be an instrument that covers developed countries and within the context of the, let's say, Kyoto type agreement, and a third one for developing countries. Even the third one will need to be separated, because when we talk about developing countries, we cannot talk about the same kind of obligations from emerging economies and developing countries in general, or even least developed countries. So some nuances will need to be introduced there. I think there are precedents. We built on some of them before Cancun. I will refer to initiatives that were taken at that time, first by India, talking about MRV, on which India made a distinction for MRV based on emissions, not on the Annex 1, non-Annex 1 countries, and that's an important step forward, because based on the level of emissions, we will have different kind of monitoring requirements. There is also a proposal, an old proposal put forward at the time by Venezuela itself, even though coming from an ALBA country, it was a very advanced proposal, also to differentiate among developing countries. And that brings me to the big issue that has been on the table from the beginning, whether the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and capabilities is still a valid one. I seriously believe it is still a valid one, and it will remain a valid principle. What has been wrongly done is the interpretation of that principle. That principle never implies that some countries do not have responsibilities. On the contrary, it implies that everybody, every single country has a responsibility and has a possibility to contribute. It means that we do not have equal responsibilities. And what we need is a different interpretation of that principle, and needs to be captured within the new legal framework, without necessarily touching to the Annex 1, non-Annex 1 issue, because that will need to, that will force us to reopen the convention. And to reopen the convention at this stage will mean a failure in Lima and in Paris. But in the new instruments that need to be built, with legally binding obligations for those countries that are not going to be part of Kyoto because they decided to, like I mentioned, Japan, Russia, the US, or additional obligations for countries like China, India, Mexico. We will need to have a different interpretation of that principle. And we need to move from the concept of the historical responsibility to the accumulated responsibility, which is a much modern conception. A country is responsible of its emissions, but not only the historic one, but the ongoing emission. And if we shift from an historic perspective, from an accumulated perspective, you will incentivize changes, because those countries who have accumulated a number of emissions will have bigger responsibilities today, but those that have not will know that if they accumulate more in the future, they will assume equal responsibility. So it's not as a static concept as it is the historical one. Finally, let me come back to the question of the public opinion and the pressure that it is going to be needed, because I'm taking too much time. I think we have basically three scenarios for the time being. One is to wait for the formal process to deliver. My understanding is that they will bring elements for an agreement in Lima. I think that's too little, too vague. So I think it is important that we start working on a draft, and probably a draft, as I mentioned, of 2-3 parallel instruments that will be needed at that time. And we need also to make sure that the Peruvian presidency can handle that process without breaking with the formal process. So in the bridge between the two processes is going to be quite important. And to do that, I think the question of bringing a little more attention to the issue is important. There is a big dilemma. On the one hand, the expectation for Lima and Paris is very low, and that allows you to take initiatives. But on the other hand, the fact that you will bring, or you will go farther than what has been formally accepted as a mandate, it is very risky. So you have to do it very carefully. You need to convince public opinion that a legally binding agreement is a legally binding agreement. We need to forget about this, what the meaning of legally binding is or not. With all due respect, this is an argument that has been used several times by spoilers in the process. It is evident that within a legally binding instrument there are elements which have obligations which are quantified, etc., and it can have a number of the understandings that are not necessarily obligations, that are kind of I don't know how to say it in English, but the vision, the expectation to move towards a direction that may not necessarily include numbers and deadlines, etc. So aspirational measures, if you want, they can be built within the legally binding instrument, but minimums in order to reach the goal that we have all agreed, which is to remain below the 2 degrees, will need to be there, both for developing as well as for developed countries. How do we reach to public? I think the work that the Commission that President Calderon is heading is obviously quite important, because we will make the economic case of it. But I also think that the meeting in New York that Ban Ki-moon is calling this year will also be a good opportunity to raise that opinion. But we need to avoid just a meeting on which we will listen to a number of statements. We need that process to have its own preparatory process. And my suggestion would be to get involvement of a minimum number of leaders for that meeting to be meaningful. I wanted to just to recall what was called the Copenhagen Commitment Circle, if I'm right, on which Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, together with Prime Minister Rasmussen, President Calderon, and Prime Minister Rudd from Australia, start a process of consultation through video conference and trying to identify the topics that they, and the leaders that they may reach in order to build some understanding. So something like that may need to be done at least, I would say, 2-3 months before the meeting in New York, if we want something else to be there. On the question of the trips, just like the point that I made to Ambassador Boto Bernales a long time ago, certainly traveling is part of fundamental issue, and in my case it was a huge number of days, but it was not only me who was traveling. There was a full team, people from the Ministry of Environment, people from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the involvement of people from the Ministry of Finance. And I will end up with a quotation. I hope that President Calderon will forgive me. But I remember one meeting in the presidential palace on which he called several ministers around the table. The Ministry of Finance included the Ministry of Energy, the Ministry of Environment, Foreign Affairs, and the Ministry of Finance at that time was Agustin Carstens. That was before Copenhagen. And the moment the meeting started, he apologized to the president and asked to be released because he needed to deal with a crisis at that time. And President Calderon did not allow him to leave. He told him that climate change was not an environmental issue, that it was a fundamental issue for the economy, that it was much more important than any other topic he had in his agenda. And he remained in the room together with the other ministers. So thank you very much.